Hello, my name is Paul Gosling, and I manage the recommended list for cereals and oilseeds at the AHDB. Over the next few minutes, I just want to give you an overview of the new winter barley recommendations for the 2025-2026 recommended list. Before I do that, though, I just want to give you a summary of the trials for the harvest 2024. Unlike crops like wheat, wet didn't actually cause us too many problems for winter barley drilling, as they were all drilled before the autumn weather broke last year. However, we did subsequently lose 2 trials due to waterlogging of trial sites. And then the wet, mild conditions over the winter and into the spring meant we had high levels of disease, and fungicide untreated yields were quite heavily suppressed compared to previous years. That meant the candidate varieties were given a severe testing, but for the current variety we've seen no changes in the ratings for disease resistance because disease pressure is taken into account in the ratings calculations anyway. We have had some changes to processes the committee's used to select varieties this year, and that's in response to the review where you said you wanted more rigorous viewing of the varieties. So the importance of untreated yield in variety selection has been increased. We've set new target ratings for all diseases, and the varieties are expected to meet those targets. If they don't meet those targets, they need a good reason why they should still be recommended. Automatic recommendation based on yield has been ended. Now all varieties will be reviewed by the committees before they're recommended. And the committees will continue to review the criteria which they use to select varieties and adjust them in response to the changing requirements of the industry. We don't do this every 5 years. When there's a review, we do this sort of review internally every year to make sure that the selection criteria are still appropriate. So moving on now to the new winter barley recommendations. Highlights for the winter barley, we've got several new 2-row feed varieties, a number with regional recommendations and for niche situations. We've got 2 6-row hybrids with very good yields. And we've got multiple new varieties with tolerant or resistance to BYD, extending the options for varieties with this trait for those growers who want to use those sort of varieties. So starting with the 2-row feed varieties, we've got KWS Valensis with a UK recommendation, Nosalena with the UK recommendation from Sonova, Kitty with the UK recommendation from Sonova, Russo with an East recommendation from Agri, KWS Heracles with a North recommendation, Rosemary with a North recommendation from Elsams, and finally Ashu Arian with a North and East recommendation from Saturn Union. The number of varieties been taken off the list this year: Bordeaux, KWS Orwell, LG Dazzle, LG Mountain and Lightning. So the next few slides you're going to see some tables that look like this. These show the main characteristics of the varieties, and I'll be comparing the varieties that have just been added to the list in bold with varieties that are currently on the list. When varieties are being selected by the committees, they compare them against current varieties, and for the winter barley feed varieties, we're looking at KWS Tardis and LG Caravel as our official comparative varieties. But coming back to the new varieties, starting with KWS Valensis. UK yields 106%, which matches Caravel, but it's 3% ahead of Tardis. East yield at 107%, again matches Caravel, but 3% ahead of Tardis. The West yield is bracketed at 104%, which means limited data. It's just below Caravel, but well ahead of Tardis. And the North yield again is bracketed, but it's 106%, putting 2% ahead of both Caravel and Tardis. Mildew is a 6, sitting in between the two comparators. Brown rust is a 7, matching Caravel. Ring sporium is a 6, matching both the comparators. And net blotch is a 6, again matching both the comparators. Untreated yield is 91%, so that matches Caravel. And specific weight is 69.8. That's a little bit behind the comparators, but not a problem there. And lodging with a PGR is a rating of 8, so that's good, matching both the comparators. In terms of ripening, it's 0, so that's the same as the comparators. Now moving on to Nosalena. UK treated yield of 106%, again matching Caravel and ahead of Tardis. East treated yield 106%, so just behind Caravel, but 2% ahead of Tardis. West yield at 103% is bracketed, sits between the two comparators, but the North yield at 108%, though it's bracketed, that is the highest treated yield on the new list. Mildew at a 6, again between the two comparators. Brown rust at a 6, matching Tardis. Rincosporium 6, the same as the two comparators, and net blotch is 6, the same as the two comparators. Untreated yield is a little bit lower at 87%. Again, that sits between the two comparators. 69.6 on specific weight, so slightly lower than the comparators again, but not a problem. And the lodging resistance of 8, that's good. Ripening again is 0, so matching the comparators. Now moving on to Kitty. Kitty is one of these more niche varieties. It has slightly lower yield at 104% of the UK, so that's just ahead of TARDIS but below Caravel. East is 104%, matching TARDIS but below Caravel. West yield is limited data at 102%, just ahead of TARDIS but 3% below Caravel. But it does have a very high north yield, though it's based on limited data. It's 108%, but so again it makes it equal highest yielding in the north. Mildew is a 6, so between the two comparators. Brown is a 5, so it's below the two comparators and a little bit disappointing, but it does have a good Rhynchosporium of 7, which is better than both the comparators. And its net blotch at 6 matches both the comparators. Perhaps because of that brown rust at a 5, its untreated yield is down at 81, which is less than the two comparators. But something that Kitty does have is very high specific weight. 72.7 makes it the highest specific weight on the list, and we know that some growers do want those really bold grains, that good grain quality, so we think that will be of attraction to some growers. Lodging is good as an 8, it is a bit later at a +2. The other thing that Kitty has, which makes it almost unique, is it has a breeder's claim for resistance to barley yellow mosaic virus strain 2. There's only one other variety on the list that has that resistance. We know that where people have a problem with barley yellow mosaic virus, this variety may come in very handy. So we think it will be of interest to a limited number of growers, but it does have an important trait or two there. This slide gives our official variety comments for the varieties I've just talked about. I'm not going to dwell on it, otherwise this will be a very long presentation. You can pause the presentation and view these at your leisure. Moving now on to those varieties with a regional recommendation. Again, I'm comparing with TARDIS and Caravel. Starting with Russo. Russo has been given just an East recommendation with 108% yield in the East. It's ahead of Caravel and ahead of TARDIS, and it will be the highest yielding variety in the East on the new recommended list. Mildew is a 5, so matching TARDIS, a couple of points below Caravel. Brown rust is a 6, the same as TARDIS, but less than Caravel. Rhynchosporium is a 5, which is less than the two comparators. Perhaps Rhynchosporium less of an issue in the East. Net blotch at 6 matches both the comparators, and its untreated yield of 90%. It's only just below Caravel and well ahead of TARDIS. Specific weight of 69.9 is good, though it's slightly below the comparators. Its lodging with the PGI is a 7, so it's just below the comparators, but not really a problem. Ripening of 0 matches the comparators. Moving on now to KWS Heracles, or Heracles. It's only been recommended in the north, but it does have a very high yield in the north, though it is bracketed 108%. That would be equal highest yielding in the north. Mildew is a 6 between the comparators. Brown rust is good at a 7, matching Caravel. Rhynchosporium is a little bit disappointing with a 5 for a north recommendation, less than both the comparators. And net blotch is also below both the comparators at 5. But it does have a high untreated yield at 91%, matching Caravel. Specific weight of 69.4, so just below the comparators, but not a problem, and it has good resistance to lodging with an 8, and it's at 0 on the ripening. Moving now on to Rosemary. Rosemary 2 has been given just a north recommendation. Yield in the north is 106% based on limited data, so 2% ahead of both the comparators. Mildew is a 5, matching TARDIS. Brown rust is a 7, matching Caravel. Rhynchosporium is a 6, matching both the comparators, and net blotch is a 6, matching both the comparators. Has good untreated yield at 90%, just 1% below Caravel. 69.1 for the specific weight, again just a little bit below the comparators, but not really a problem. It's got a 7 for lodging resistance, so just below the comparators, and it is slightly later at a +1, but not really a problem there. Finally, moving on to SU Arian. It has a East and a North recommendation. East yield is 107%, so very high in the East, matching Caravel. In the North, it's bracketed figures, so limited data, but 105%, beating both the comparators. There's a very high mildew resistance rating at 8, beating both the comparators. Brown rust is a 6, the same as TARDIS. Rhynchosporium is a 6, the same as both the comparators. Has a good net blotch resistance at a 7, better than both the comparators, but its untreated yields, perhaps surprisingly, is only 86%, but that is ahead of TARDIS. Specific weight is slightly lower at 68.8, but not a problem. It does only have a 6 for resistance to lodging with PGR, so that will need managing. And ripening is a 0, the same as the comparators. Again, I'm not going to dwell on these variety comments. You can look at these at your own leisure. Moving now on to 6-row hybrid feed varieties, we've got 2 new varieties this year. Innis with a UK recommendation from KWS and SY Quantock with a UK recommendation from Syngenta. And we've taken Bazooka and Thunderbolt off the list this year. So again, I'll be using comparative varieties to look at these new varieties. SY Neffin and SY Canyon are our official comparative varieties which the committees use, but I've got put SY Kingsbarn on there because Kingsbarn does dominate the hybrid barley market with around 60% of the market. So looking first at Innis, it's a UK yield of 109%. That's ahead of all our comparators and ahead of Kingsbarn by a couple of percent. East yield also 109%, ahead of all our comparators, and a very high West yield, 112%. It is worth saying that that is based only on 4 trials, so we need to give some caution around that, but it does look like it has a high West yield. And the North yield, 106%, so the same as Canyon, better than Neffin, just below Kingsbarn. Again, it's based on limited data, but 6 trials in the North, so slightly more trials, so a little bit more confidence in that figure. Mildew resistance is a 7, so same as Kingsbarn and Canyon, not quite as much as Neffin. And brown rust is a 6, so same as Neffin and Canyon, better than Kingsbarn. Ring sporum is a 6, which is below all the other varieties, which is a little bit disappointing, but it's not a low figure. And 5 for net blotch is the same as Canyon and Kingsbarn. Untreated yield is good at 90%, so just below Neffin and Canyon and well ahead of Kingsbarn. Specific weight of 69.3 is less than the comparators, but it's not really a problem. And it does have good resistance to lodging with an 8 for lodging with PGR. Ripening is the same as the varieties, other varieties at a -1. Moving then on to SY Quantock, again 109% UK yield, so ahead of all the comparative varieties here. The East yield at 106% matches Neffin and Kingsbarn and just ahead of Canyon. And again, a very high West yield at 112%, but just care with that figure because it's only based on 4 trials, but it does suggest it will have a strong East yield. Also has a very high yield in the North at 109%. That's the highest on the list of any variety, but again, it's limited data just based on 6 trials, so a little bit of caution around that number. Mildew is a 7, equaling Canyon and Kingsbarn. Brown rust is 6, matching Neffin and Canyon and better than Kingsbarn. And ring sporum is 7, same as all the comparators. Net blotch is a 6, so better than Canyon and Kingsbarn. And with a 93% untreated yield, that will make it the highest untreated yield of any variety on the winter barley list. Specific weight of 70.4, so around the same as the comparators. Lodging is 7, better than the comparators, and a -1 on the ripening. Again, I'm not going to pause on those. You can look at them at your leisure. So then moving on to our BYDV resistant variety. And the first one we've got is a BYDV resistant 6-row hybrid feed. So many of the varieties of winter barley which have claimed BYDV tolerance, this one actually has resistance, which means it should show very few, if any, symptoms, and there'll be little, if any, virus replication. SY Kestrel, of course, comes from Syngenta, and that's been given a UK recommendation, and we've removed SY Buzzard from the list in this category this year. So because Kestrel was, Buzzard was removed from the list, there aren't any comparators. So what I'm going to do with Kestrel is compare it a bit against Kingsbarn. Obviously Kingsbarn doesn't have BYDV tolerance, but as I've already said, it does dominate that hybrid barley market. So I think it's a reasonable comparator. So in terms of UK treated yield, 104%, it's just below Kingsbarn. East yield is a little bit below Kingsbarn, but in the West, interestingly, they're bracketed figures, so it's limited data. It matches Kingsbarn. And in the North, it's just below Kingsbarn based on limited data. So yes, its yield is a bit low, but it does have that BYDV resistant trait. Mildew is a 7, so matches Kingsbarn. Brown rust is a 6, better than Kingsbarn. Rhynchosporium is a 7, same as Kingsbarn. And net blotch is a 6, better than Kingsbarn. And that better disease resistance ratings feed through to the untreated yield at 86%, 4% ahead of Kingsbarn. Specific weight at 68.7 is a little bit below Kingsbarn, but it's not a problem. And it does have better lodging resistance than Kingsbarn at a 7. In terms of ripening, it's the same as Kingsbarn at -1, and it does have this BYDV tolerance. So yield's not quite as high in the treatment, but it does have good disease resistance, does have good untreated yield, and it does have BYDV resistance and better lodging resistance. So I'm sure it will be of interest to some growers. Moving now into more BYDV varieties. These are 6-row BYDV tolerant varieties, conventional varieties. So because they're tolerant rather than resistant, they will show some symptoms, but should show little or no yield loss as a consequence. We have 2 varieties in this category, Integral from Agri and 60 from Elsams, both with a UK recommendation, and we didn't remove any varieties in this category this year. So this time our official comparator, which the committees use, is KWS Fearish, but again I put Kingsbarn on there. It's not one of our official comparators, but it is very widely grown 6-row variety. So looking at our new recommendations, starting with Integral, there's a UK yield of 105%, which is well ahead of KWS Fearish, which is a BYDV tolerant variety. East yield of 105%, well ahead of Fearish, and only just below Kingsbarn. West yield, it's bracketed, so that's just those 4 trials, so it's limited data, but it's well ahead of Fearish and only just below Kingsbarn. North yield, bracketed, 103%, ahead of Fearish, 4% below Kingsbarn. Mildew resistance is a little bit of an issue at a 4, so that will put some growers off, but I'm sure not everyone. Brown rust is a 6, so the same as Fearish and better than Kingsbarn. Rhynchosporium is a 6, the same as Fearish, better than one below Kingsbarn. And net blotch is a 6, same as Fearish and better than Kingsbarn. It does have a high untreated yield at 91%, beating both Fearish and Kingsbarn by some margin. Specific weight of 69.4 is ahead of Fearish and just below Kingsbarn, and it does have good resistance to lodging with 8 with PGR, so better than Kingsbarn and better than Fearish. In terms of ripening, it's a 0, so the same as Fearish, not quite as early as Kingsbarn. And of course, it does have BYDV tolerance, which Kingsbarn doesn't, but which Fearish does. Moving on now to 60. 60 is a little bit of a different sort of variety from Integral. It is, of course, BYDV tolerant, and it does yield high and with treated yields. In the UK, it's 105%, so 3% ahead of Fearish, just below Kingsbarn. In the East, 104%, ahead of Fearish, just below Kingsbarn. In the West, it's a limited data figure, so 105%, but it's well ahead of Fearish, and very high in the North at 107%, again on limited data, but that does match Kingsbarn, and it's full 6% ahead of Fearish. Mildew resistance is good for 60 with a 7, matching Kingsbarn. Brown rust is a 5, matching Kingsbarn. Rhynchosporium is a 6, same as Fearish, just below Kingsbarn. And net blotch is a 5, same as Kingsbarn, just below Fearish. It does have a fairly low untreated yield at 75%, which doesn't seem to match its disease resistance ratings. That will be of concern to some growers. It's not really a low input variety. You will need to treat this variety to get good yields out of it. Specific weight is a little bit low as well at 66.7, but it's certainly not a disaster. Lodging with PGI is an 8, so that's obviously better than Kingsbarn and better than Fearish, and it is a +1, but it does have that BYDV tolerance. So there's a different sort of variety to Integral, not a low input variety, but it does have that BYDV tolerance and options for SFI payments there. Again, I won't linger on the comments. Then moving on to our 2-row BYDV tolerant varieties. So this is a new category on the RL. We haven't had any 2-row BYDV tolerant varieties before. We've got 2 this year. Organa from Sonova, which has been giving a UK recommendation, and LG Carpenter, which has been giving an East and West recommendation. That is, of course, from Lima grain. And we haven't removed any varieties because there were no varieties of this type previously. Here I'm going back to our official two-row comparators. These were not the comparators used for the assessment of these varieties because those two aren't BYDV tolerant, but they are the two most widely grown varieties of two-row barley, so they do make sensible comparators. Looking then first of all at Elgana, UK yield of 102%, below Caravel, just below Tardis. In the east, though, it's doing a bit better, 105%, so that's just ahead of Tardis and only a couple of percent below Caravel. In the west, it's a limited figure, just below Tardis, 4% below Caravel, and in the north, 100% limited data, several percent below Caravel and Tardis. Mildew resistance is a 6, so it's between the two comparators. Brown rust is a 7, so that matches Caravel and it's ahead of Tardis. And Rincosporium, a good rating there, 7, beating both the comparators. The net blotch at a 5 is below both the comparators. Does have a good untreated yield at 90%, just 1% below Caravel and well ahead of Tardis. And specific weight of 69.6, so just below the comparators, isn't a problem. Lodging is a 7, so below the comparators, but not really a problem. And ripening is the same. And of course, it does have that BYDV tolerance, which gives you options in terms of SFI and also reduced inputs. Moving on now to LG Carpenter, again 102% in the UK, so just below Tardis, 104% in the east, so matching Tardis, and just below Caravel, 101% in the west, bracketed figure, so limited data and matching Tardis, and that low north yield was the reason it wasn't giving a north recommendation. Mildew, it sits between the comparators. It's got a good brown rust rating of 7, matching Caravel, and a good Rincosporium rating of 7, beating both the comparators. In terms of untreated yield, it does very well at 92%, so that beats Caravel. It's well ahead of Tardis. And lodging is a little bit lower at a 6, so that will need some managing. And then ripening is 0, the same as the comparator, and of course it does have the BYDV tolerance, giving extra options. Again, I won't pause very long on those. And that is the end of the presentation. There are other presentations for the other major crops available on the website, and you can view those at your leisure too.